A Nebraska patrolman stops his car in 1967 and vanishes for over 20 minutes. Some of what we know comes from police logs and physical marks on his vehicle. Other details only surfaced later under hypnosis, where he described beings marked by a serpent crest. At the time, his report was folded into the Condon Committee's dismissal of UFO cases, an institutional move that slowed serious study for decades. But today, with NASA, AARO, and even congressional hearings acknowledging unexplained aerial phenomena, his file looks very different. So who was this officer, and what happened on that cold Nebraska night? The patrolman in the dead of night. On the cold night of December 3, 1967, a young patrolman named Herbert Schirmer was on duty in Ashland, Nebraska. The quiet hours of a small-town shift usually passed without notice, the kind of routine that never made the papers. Schirmer, just 22 years old, had already served in the U.S. Navy before joining the police force. His colleagues knew him as steady and disciplined, someone unlikely to risk his career with a reckless claim. That reputation is exactly why what he wrote in his patrol log would become so significant and so costly. At precisely 2:30 in the morning, while driving along Highway 6 near its junction with Highway 63, Schirmer saw red lights ahead on the dark road. At first, he assumed they belonged to a stalled truck or construction hazard, but as he slowed his vehicle to approach, the source of the lights became unmistakably strange. Hovering in front of him was a disc-shaped craft, metallic and domed, glowing with a ring of colored lights along its rim. Later, when he sat down with his logbook, he didn't hedge or soften the account. In plain, official handwriting, he entered 2:30 a.m., saw UFO at Junction 6 and 63. That brief line, filed as part of routine police documentation, gave his sighting a permanence many other reports lacked. No rumor, no passing anecdote, this was a sworn officer on duty, recording it in the same book that tracked every traffic stop and call for assistance. It placed his story in the department's record where every other officer would see it, and that choice carried both weight and consequence. When Schirmer returned from patrol that morning, something didn't add up. His timeline from the encounter to returning to the station appeared to be off. Roughly 20 minutes were missing, time that could not be accounted for. He himself couldn't explain it. The gap was not a momentary lapse of memory, but a precise stretch of minutes that seemed to have vanished. For a trained officer, accustomed to tracking details and recording exact times, this was deeply unsettling. What troubled him more than the sight of the craft itself was realizing that part of his own night could not be recovered. That discrepancy in his log, more than anything else, would later push investigators to suggest hypnotic regression as a tool to uncover what had happened in those missing minutes. Inside the station, his colleagues reacted as expected in the culture of the time, with skepticism, some laughter, and occasional mockery. In the 1960s, police work in small towns leaned heavily on pragmatism. Stories of unexplained lights were easily dismissed as fatigue, tricks of vision, or vehicles mistaken in poor light. For some, the idea of a craft hovering at a highway junction was absurd on its face. Yet the unshakable problem was this: it wasn't just a private story. It was written in official ink, entered into a logbook that everyone had to read. That entry, stark and unemotional, became the core of his testimony. There was nothing embellished about it, no descriptive flourish, just the straightforward note of an officer documenting an incident as though it were any other call. In that simplicity lay its importance. Researchers later pointed to the log as one of the most concise and credible pieces of UFO documentation in the public record, an unembellished statement committed at the exact time of the event. But that act of honesty also closed off other paths. Once the entry existed, Schirmer could not retreat from it without undermining his entire credibility as a police officer. The missing time quickly overshadowed everything else. Schirmer found himself dwelling on it more than the sight of the glowing disc. He knew he hadn't simply dozed off behind the wheel, and he couldn't blame exhaustion. He had lived his professional life on strict schedules, every moment accounted for, and now here was a gap he couldn't explain to his sergeant, to his fellow officers, or even to himself. It shook his confidence in the tools he trusted most, his own memory and training. That unease would grow into a consuming need for answers, a need that eventually led him into the hands of outside investigators. For others around him, however, the case was already straining patience. Jokes circulated inside the station, whispers followed him, and questions about his reliability grew. In a close-knit town, reputation was everything, and his began to unravel. The ridicule didn't come in dramatic accusations, but in the steady drip of doubt that undermined his standing. When word spread beyond Ashland, the pressure became sharper. For a young man barely out of the military and just starting a police career, the added scrutiny proved overwhelming. Eventually, it cost him that career. His decision to record everything openly had given his story credibility, but it also made him an easy target for dismissal. Even with that personal toll, the strangeness of the night did not fade. Schirmer remained convinced that something out of the ordinary had occurred, something beyond a trick of vision. The glowing saucer was one thing, but the lost 20 minutes were something else entirely, an anomaly his training could not rationalize away. As the days and weeks went on, the gap in memory gnawed at him, pushing him to accept help from researchers seeking to probe deeper into what might have transpired. By then, his case had already attracted notice outside Nebraska. Local ridicule was one thing, but once scientific investigators became aware of both the log entry and the unexplained time loss, they decided the report could not simply be ignored. How those investigators ultimately framed and dismissed Schirmer's experience would play a decisive role in how abduction cases were treated in the years that followed. The Condon Committee's dismissal. In 1968, Herbert Schirmer's encounter was taken up by the University of Colorado UFO Project, better known as the Condon Committee. Funded by the U.S. Air Force, this study was advertised as the government's definitive word on UFOs. To the public, it seemed like the kind of inquiry that would either legitimize decades of strange reports or shut the door entirely. For Schirmer, who had already risked everything by writing his log entry, this meant his night in Ashland was about to be examined not just as an isolated oddity, but as part of the most heavily publicized scientific review of the subject. Investigators noted that the most puzzling aspect of the story was not simply the glowing craft, but the 20-minute gap in his timeline. Stress-induced lapse didn't explain it, and for a sworn officer used to noting the exact times of events, the discrepancy was glaring. Investigators recommended that he undergo hypnotic regression to probe what had happened during those missing minutes. Sessions were conducted by Dr. Leo Sprinkle, a psychologist from the University of Wyoming who became one of the first academics to treat abduction claims with seriousness instead of derision. Through these sessions, Schirmer recalled more than just lights in the Nebraska sky. Fragments emerged of being immobilized, escorted by beings in uniforms marked with a serpent-like emblem, and told, strangely, that he was a kind of watchman for his community. These details, unsettling though they were, brought coherence to the lost time, yet the committee remained wary. They classified the accounts not as evidence of contact, but as products of dreamlike imagination, suggesting his subconscious had produced a narrative to fill the blank period. The final report put it bluntly: his experience was best explained as hallucination or fantasy. It did not accuse him of fabricating the story, but its language undermined his reliability. To the public, the message was clear: this was not an authentic encounter. For Schirmer, who had already endured ridicule from colleagues, the committee's stamp of dismissal crushed any hope that stepping forward would matter. The weight of the Condon report was enormous. Newspapers adopted its conclusions immediately. Politicians and educators cited it as settled fact. The prevailing narrative became that UFOs held no scientific value, and cases like Schirmer's were written off as curiosities unworthy of further study. In its broader scope, the committee advised that Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official investigation, should be terminated. Within a year, it was. For decades afterward, that report was the shield institutions held up any time the subject reappeared. But one important detail often went unmentioned outside specialist circles. While the committee's public summary dismissed most cases, the internal files preserved by the project contained numerous incidents that were never explained. The public-facing conclusion was that UFOs were not worth investigating, yet the working documents showed cases that remained unresolved. This split between private documentation and public narrative has become central to how later researchers evaluate the committee's work. From today's vantage point, the institutional pressures that shaped the report stand out. It was written in the heat of the Cold War, when admitting to unknown craft or abductions would have raised serious national security questions. A police officer taken against his will in rural Nebraska wasn't just an oddity. If accepted at face value, it suggested the U.S. military's inability to protect its own territory. For officials, presenting a statement that neutralized the threat was safer than admitting vulnerability. Calling Schirmer's memories dreamlike kept the subject contained. Others, however, have read more into this handling. Some researchers, and more recently, certain whistleblower accounts, suggest that the committee's mandate was shaped by institutional constraints. According to this view, the outcome was never going to be open-ended science, but a managed conclusion that protected broader priorities. While proving that claim outright remains impossible, current acknowledgments from AARO and NASA have shown why skepticism toward past dismissals persists. These modern agencies now admit that unidentified objects often defy explanation, a stark reversal from 1968's confident rejection. The consequences for Schirmer were immediate. Once the committee's assessment was published, journalists and locals treated him as a curiosity at best and an unreliable witness at worst. Pranks and vandalism targeted his home. His standing as a law enforcement officer collapsed. The official conclusion that his memories were dreamlike became justification for public ridicule. In effect, his credibility was sacrificed to maintain the institutional narrative. Looking back, the irony is sharp. Many of the elements dismissed in his story, lost time, physical marks, interference with vehicle electronics, and fragmented recall under hypnosis, are now widely recognized in modern abduction reports. Today, Pentagon documents list electromagnetic anomalies and physiological aftereffects as common data points in unresolved cases. The pattern that Schirmer described in 1967 is echoed across reports gathered decades later. That consistency forces a reconsideration. What was set aside as fantasy may have been the beginning of a broader, still unfolding pattern. Yet attending to that consistency too late came at a cost. The Condon Committee's portrayal not only damaged Schirmer personally, but also stalled public research on abduction reports for years. Scientific study followed the lead of the report, avoiding the topic almost entirely, while those who did take it up were marginalized. Questions that could have been addressed in the late 1960s were postponed until a new generation of witnesses and researchers pushed them back again into the open. Even so, Schirmer's case never entirely vanished. His regression sessions remained on file, his police log remained intact, and investigators who dared to look found them difficult to reconcile with the official dismissal. What stood out most was that under guided hypnosis, details surfaced in a structured way that seemed at odds with the idea of random fantasy. These accounts, preserved but disregarded, are what the next phase of his story turned on. As his memories under hypnosis unfolded, they revealed imagery and experiences far beyond the sparse patrol log entry he had written at 2:30 a.m. That is where the story takes its most unsettling turn. Inside Schirmer's mind under hypnosis. Hypnosis was the tool investigators turned to when confronting the 20 minutes of missing time Schirmer simply could not explain. But before describing what he reported in those sessions, it is important to be clear. Hypnotic regression is one of the most debated and criticized methods in the study of alleged abductions. Psychologists warn that suggestion can distort memory, producing vivid but inaccurate recollections. False memories, confabulation, and the power of expectation can all weave their way into what a witness believes is recovered truth. Researchers in the psychosocial tradition especially argue that cultural inputs, interviewer framing, and the witness's own subconscious can generate abduction imagery without any external event. With that caution in mind, Schirmer's sessions still yielded accounts that drew serious attention at the time, both because of their detail and because of the physical marks his body seemed to carry afterward. Schirmer's first sessions were guided by Dr. Leo Sprinkle, a psychologist from Wyoming willing to treat the material without mockery. Later, he also worked with Dr. Loring Williams, whose approach differed but probed the same gaps in memory. Under hypnosis, Schirmer reported fragments, flashes of sensation, sudden images, and impressions that slipped away almost as quickly as they surfaced. At first, there was resistance. He described blank spots where nothing came through, only to be followed by sudden bursts of sharp detail. The patterns were not coherent stories at the start, but gradually, they formed into something resembling a sequence. Under hypnosis, he recalled being unable to move near the glowing craft. His body, he said, would not respond to commands, not because he was afraid, but because something external was controlling him. He saw the craft close up, not just a light in the sky, but a solid, structured object, a domed oval or football shape, with panels and seams he associated with the mechanics he knew in the 1960s. He drew comparisons to radar consoles and engine casings, trying to make sense of unfamiliar technology through familiar categories. In recounting it, he stressed the difference between fear and paralysis, and this distinction would later become a pattern in many reports that followed. The beings themselves he described as humanoid figures in uniforms bearing a conspicuous insignia. During regression, he repeatedly emphasized one element above all, a crest or emblem shaped like a serpent. It was distinctive enough that he mentioned it even as other parts of the memory varied. He said the symbol conveyed a sense of authority, a kind of badge or rank that marked them out. His focus on that image was consistent, even when details about their surroundings or number drifted from one session to another. He reported experiencing direct communication from the figures, conveyed not through voices but as thought echoing in his mind. At one moment, he recalled them addressing him directly as Watchman. The choice of word disturbed him, because it bound his professional duty as a police officer to their encounter in a way that felt deliberate. It suggested selection, not randomness. Alongside these recollections, investigators noted physical traces. Schirmer had a distinct welt along his neck and irregular marks on his skin. He associated one with being touched or examined during the encounter. These marks faded but were documented, and they gave his story a weight it lacked otherwise. Whatever the hypnotic material represented, the fact remained that his body bore lingering evidence of an unusual event. It was the presence of those physical signs, combined with the recorded gap in his police log, that made researchers reluctant to dismiss him as merely delusional. As sessions continued, his fragmented impressions began to thread together. He reported being inside the craft, seeing metallic walls and a kind of control room with instruments he mapped onto his own knowledge base, screens, panels, equipment that held objects suspended. He did not describe it with grand or cosmic language, but rather through comparisons to the tools of mechanics and radar technology. This grounded tone set his story apart from the kind of dreamlike narratives critics expected. Yet all the while, the question lingered. Were these recovered memories accurate recollections or fabrications produced under hypnosis? Critics seized on his inconsistencies. In one recall, he described multiple beings, in another, only two. The look of the chamber shifted from metallic to glowing in different accounts. Sometimes the communication sounded mechanical, other times human-like. These inconsistencies, critics argued, were hallmarks of suggestion, hypnosis stitching fragments into a shaky narrative. Supporters countered that trauma often fractures memory, and that the core elements, the paralysis, the serpent emblem, the inside of the craft, the imposed communication, remained steady regardless of variation in peripheral details. The duality ran through every session. On one hand, the content fit patterns that became familiar decades later: lost time, paralysis, mental communication, and aftereffects on the body. On the other, the method itself ensured that doubt would never vanish. The possibility of implanted or distorted memory made every detail suspect. To some, Schirmer's regression makes him one of the first recorded abductees describing features that later cases echoed. To others, his sessions stand as early examples of how hypnosis could inadvertently create or reinforce the very abduction template that later witnesses would unconsciously draw upon. Despite the debate, Schirmer did not expand his story into something more sensational over the years. The accounts he gave under hypnosis remained relatively constant. He returned again and again to the same sensations: the immobilization he could not fight, the mental intrusion that carried the word Watchman, and the serpent emblem that would not leave his mind. He did not build layers of new encounters on top of his original story, as some hoaxers have been known to do. His restraint, intentional or not, preserved the case as a fixed moment rather than a growing legend. For researchers, the hypnotic sessions proved influential. They demonstrated the potential of regression to retrieve hidden memories, but they also showcased every risk the method carried. As later abduction cases emerged, hypnosis became a standard tool used by many investigators despite its controversies. In this sense, Schirmer's case set a precedent, one that shaped the study of claimed abductions for decades afterward, for better and worse. In the end, what stands out is not just what Schirmer said under hypnosis, but the way certain details refused to fade, chief among them the uniforms marked with a strange emblem. That single image became the enduring centerpiece of his account, both disturbing to him and puzzling to those who listened. It would not remain unique to Ashland, Nebraska. In later years, other witnesses across different places and times would describe insignias that bore an uncanny resemblance, raising questions about how such a specific symbol could appear again and again in accounts that were never meant to intersect. The serpent emblem, a pattern across encounters. When Schirmer described his encounter, the feature he returned to most often was not the craft itself, but the insignia on the being's uniforms. He reported it as a winged serpent, an image positioned like a badge on the chest where police or military personnel would place a rank symbol. Despite uncertainty and other details, this emblem was the one element that never faded from his mind. Researchers at the time took note of its peculiarity, since in 1967 abduction reports rarely included such specific iconography. Most cases described vague humanoid figures or luminous shapes. Clear markings of organization or rank were unusual, making this part of his account stand out. Years later, however, his serpent emblem wouldn't remain an isolated curiosity. In 1979, an abduction in Florida involving Filiberto Cardenas produced a strikingly similar detail. He reported being taken aboard a craft and encountering figures whose uniforms carried serpentine insignias. The parallels between his encounter and Schirmer's earlier memory caught the attention of investigators. At that point, researchers began to suggest that Schirmer's serpentwing motif might not have been a random invention, but part of a recurring pattern. Further testimony added to the list. In South Carolina during the 1970s, a man named Bill Herman reported uniformed figures who bore serpent-like symbols. In Newfoundland, witnesses of unusual encounters spoke of serpent emblems linked to the beings they saw. In Colombia, cases surfaced where civilians described similar insignias on uniforms. Each report came from different settings, cultures, and witnesses with no connection to one another. Still, the same recurring symbol intruded on their accounts: the serpent, sometimes winged, sometimes stylized, but consistent in its association with uniformed figures. For Schirmer in 1967, there was no way to draw from such testimonies. They had not yet been made. No collections of insignia existed. No catalog of alien crests could have influenced his description. The database of repeating images would only emerge decades later, and it was researchers who painstakingly noticed overlaps across cases long separated by geography and time. By the 1980s, the serpent wing emblem was no longer just Schirmer's lonely detail. It was part of a small but persistent chain of independent reports, each echoing what he had written down more than a decade earlier. Beyond the reports themselves, serpents occupy a notable position in human symbolism. They appear as archetypes across ancient cultures: the feathered serpent of Mesoamerican tradition, the serpent deities of India, and the winged serpents found in Near Eastern accounts. In Western religious texts, serpents often serve as bearers of hidden knowledge or temptation. Because of their recurring presence in myths, some investigators argue that these abduction accounts may be drawing subconsciously from shared cultural imagery rather than external reality. Others propose the reverse, that the beings themselves deliberately use serpent motifs precisely because humans recognize their power and respond to them instinctively. Recent research has even pointed to unusual parallels in the documents, controversial files dating to mid-20th century Spain, in which serpent-like imagery appears within supposed communications from non-human entities. While these files remain debated and often criticized as hoaxes, their inclusion of serpent motifs is what later led some scholars to wonder whether cross-cultural serpent symbolism played a more active role in alleged contact narratives. It is, however, an open question rather than proof. What matters in the context of Schirmer's case is that this emblem, so sharply defined in his regression sessions, later echoed through multiple lines of testimony, myth, and even disputed literature. This repetition raises the possibility that what witnesses describe is not incidental decoration, but a kind of identifying mark. Uniform insignia in human society often signal faction, rank, or allegiance. If non-human groups exist, as abductees claim, their use of recurring crest symbols would likewise suggest organized structure. Whether the serpent emblem belongs to one recurring faction reappearing worldwide, or whether different groups adopted similar imagery independently, remains unresolved. Some researchers interpret the consistency as evidence of a single faction visiting across decades. Others see it as an archetypal image projected differently by disparate witnesses. Both readings remain active areas of debate. What continues to unsettle researchers is the geographic and cultural distance between these reports. Florida, Nebraska, Newfoundland, Colombia, South Carolina, all sites track back to separate witnesses who spoke with different investigators, often in different languages, long before the internet could spread motifs widely. The replication of details before such communication was possible complicates theories of cultural contamination. If the symbol spread, it did so in ways still difficult to explain by ordinary channels. As with the serpent's symbolic weight in myth, scholars disagree on interpretation. Skeptics point to archetypal psychology, suggesting that stress, suggestion, and cultural background might combine to generate serpent imagery in altered states of consciousness. Believers counter that the very durability of such motifs, surfacing spontaneously in isolation across time, suggests contact with an external pattern repeating itself. For them, insignia are not a product of inner fantasy but outward signs of intentional identity, perhaps deliberately displayed to those chosen to witness. However one interprets it, the serpent wing emblem cannot be dismissed as a single unreliable description anymore. Once corroborating reports surfaced, the question evolved from whether Schirmer imagined it to whether we are seeing repeated representations of uniform iconography across independent accounts. For Schirmer personally, the price was that he endured ridicule for mentioning what others at the time saw as absurd embellishment. Yet in retrospect, the emblem became one of the most consistent themes in similar encounters. If the emblem is indeed more than coincidence, it broadens Schirmer's case from an isolated police report into part of a larger trajectory of encounters. On the other hand, if serpent imagery merely reflects the workings of the subconscious, it still remains valuable for showing how powerful archetypal symbols shape abduction testimonies. Either interpretation reinforces why researchers now catalog insignia details carefully. Small images on uniforms, once overlooked, proved to be among the rare threads that tie cases together across decades.